if I could sum up my view of the State of the Union in two simple words, it would be, we're broke. The fact is that, once again, this year, we will spend more money than we have, borrowing about 40 cents out of every dollar that we spend. We have just passed the $15 trillion mark in terms of on-the-books debt. But that debt only takes into account a small portion of the actual indebtedness that this country faces. If you want to look at the way debt is calculated, there are actually three types of debt that this country faces. The first and most widely considered is debt held by the public. This is debt that the government owes people and institutions in this country or other countries. It's the bonds, essentially, that the government owes, and people have them in their portfolios, and China holds them, and Japan holds them, and this is sort of the on-the-books most real debt, if you will. Is probably about $11 trillion, roughly, at this point. There's a second type of debt that goes into the public debt, and this is called intergovernmental debt. This is debt, in essence, that the government owes itself or owes to its various trust funds and entities. There's over 100 of these trust funds and revolving accounts and so on. The two largest that are most commonly talked about are Social Security Trust Fund and the Medicare Trust Fund. There's also the Highway Trust Fund. There's a special trust fund for the Gulf oil spill, and there's all sorts of these things. And there's another $4 trillion or so that the government owes these various trust funds. Now, that is in some ways a little softer than debt held by the public, but ultimately it has to be repaid, and therefore it's a very real debt that the government will ultimately have to come up with money with which to pay. And you add that $4 trillion to the $11 trillion in debt held by the public, and you get about $15 trillion. But there's a third type of debt as well, and this is the sort of implicit debt or unfunded obligations that the government owes to programs such as Medicare and Social Security going forward. We are able to look at these programs, and we know roughly what they are going to have to spend in the future under current law, that assuming that we pay the benefits just as we're promised to do under current law, we know how much those will cost. And we're able to project going forward how much revenue is expected to come in from the taxes that theoretically support these programs, the payroll tax and so forth. So we are able, therefore, to make a projection of the shortfall between what we've projected in terms of spending and the projections and what we expect to take in terms of revenue. And the shortfall on these programs adds up to somewhere in the area of, 100 to 105 trillion dollars. That is trillion with a T, meaning that our total unfunded obligations is somewhere in excess of $120 trillion. As I said earlier, we're broke. Now, just to put this in perspective, I have a couple slides up here, and unfortunately I think it's going to be very hard to read these because of the lighting in the room, but if you want to look at the second bar over there, this is the unfunded obligations of various countries that I was just talking about, the total indebtedness that I was just mentioning, done as a percentage of the gross domestic product in those countries. The second bar from the left, the second tallest one, that is Greece. And we all know that Greece is in trouble. You can't pick up a newspaper these days without reading about the Greek crisis and how is the Eurozone ever going to bail out Greece. And you're absolutely right. Greece is over 800%, roughly almost about 860% of their gross domestic product they owe. I mean, when you think about it, they owe 8.5 times the value of everything that's produced in their country over the course of a year. When you owe 8 times your salary, just put it in that value. When your credit card debt is 8 times bigger than your salary, you've got a problem. The third from the left over there, getting down into something more reasonable range, that a little over 500%, that's France. So the quintessential EU welfare state, France there, they owe about 5 times their GDP in terms of unfunded obligations going forward. And you can see that almost all of Europe is more than double their GDP in terms of their debt. So Europe's got some real problems going forward. You'll also notice that the one country I didn't mention was the last number over there on the far right, the tallest bar there, that's the United States. We owe about 900% of GDP in terms of our unfunded obligations, 9 times the value of everything that's produced in this country. Our unfunded obligations in this country are now higher than any of the European countries, including that of Greece. Clearly, we're broke. One other point I want to make is that for all the attention that debt is getting and the deficits and the unfunded obligations and all that terrible number I just gave you, the reality is that debt is merely a symptom of the disease. Debt is not the disease itself. It is a symptom of the size of government. This is a projection from the Congressional Budget Office of the growth in government. Traditionally, government in this country has been about 21%. The federal government's been about 21% of GDP. It's taken in about 18% of GDP in taxes. That's why we've had a little bit of a deficit. Taxes, largely because of the recession, a little bit because of the tax cuts and some other things are down now. But government is now about 25% of GDP in terms of federal spending. If you throw in state and local spending on top of that, we're about 35% of GDP is being spent by government at all levels. Going forward, it's projected that we will be over 60% of GDP by the middle of the century. Government at all levels in this country will be spending 60 cents out of every dollar produced in this country. Now, whether that's financed through higher taxes or financed through debt, that is an unsustainable level of government spending. And you're unlikely to hear anything in either the State of the Union or the Republican response tonight that is going to seriously impact this projected growth in government. And just to show you where that would leave us, this is size of government today in EU countries. And again, you can find that in most of these countries, the government spending hovers somewhere around 50% of GDP. This is government spending at all levels. The bar on the far right over there is where the United States will be in 2050. We would have a larger government in 2050 than any EU country has today. So we would be a bigger welfare state than France or Greece or Italy or Spain and so forth. We are clearly growing government at an unsustainable level. Now, I know that one of the things you'll hear tonight is that we can solve all this if all we do is raise taxes on the rich. Dan Mitchell's going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute and why that's not going to work, but I just had one slide I wanted to show you. This is a slide to illustrate the dark bond over there on the far right is the total unfunded liabilities we're facing for these various programs that I mentioned. The striped bar there is debt held by the public plus intergovernmental debt. That's the $15 trillion in actual debt. If you stack one on top of the other, you will get our actual debt of a little over 900%. The gray bar on the far left is the wealth of every millionaire and billionaire in America. If you went out and confiscated every penny owned by every millionaire and billionaire, you would not make a dent in what this country owes. Leaving aside the fact that you couldn't do it a second time and the fact that you would have a slight impact on our economy if you did that, you wouldn't make a dent in the debt. So something like the Buffett rule, which is supposed to get you $16 billion over the next 10 years, is not going to solve our debt problem. Simply put, State of the Union is we're broke and we can't tax our way out of it.